evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to the second episode of Policy Circle's webinar series, Delhi Dialogues. This webinar is presented with partnership with Niti Aayog. Today, our panel of experts will discuss the significance of a robust public health system for India. COVID-19 emerged as a global health crisis that has had multilateral impacts on countries, including the health system. The pandemic brought several lessons in its wake. For India, it has served as a wake-up call to strengthen its public health infrastructure. Among other topics that will be discussed today are how India's health system compares with the best of the world, need-based supply of educational institutions, training and deployment of healthcare staff, policy changes in the light of the pandemic, and community involvement in planning and monitoring of services. We have a panel of eminent speakers who will share their opinion on the topic. Let me first introduce our speakers. I'll take this honor of inviting Dr. Anthony K.R., Independent Monitor with National Health Mission, Government of India. T. Sundaraman, former Executive Director, National Health System Resource Center, Delhi, and Global Chairperson, People's Health Movement. Dr. Yogesh Jain, Primary Healthcare Expert, Jan Swasth Sahyog, New Delhi, and Dr. Rama Baru, Center of Social Medicine and Community Health, Jawaharlal Nehru University. A very warm welcome to all our panelists. Also, I extend a hearty welcome to the audience. After the presentations by the speakers, you could put your questions to them. Please send your queries through the chat box. I'll pass them on to the speakers. And before commencing the show, I would request the audience to kindly mute themselves when the speakers are giving their presentation. This will ensure the show to go seamlessly. I would now invite Dr. Anthony K.R. to take the charge of the first session. Dr. Anthony, I would request you to kindly take the charge of the first session.
Okay. Good evening, friends. And it's in the order of introduction, the panelists will be speaking, and each panelist will be speaking for 10 to 12 minutes, and there will be a warning, and then they will have to wind up. And if they can come in the discussion later on, if any unfinished areas are there, but we want to follow this discipline. And let me, being the first opening batsman, let me start my presentation, and just give me 1 minute for screen share. Yeah. So I'm starting now. We are discussing Indian public health system. It's a restructuring and revamping. For what? Because we have seen these pictures, and all of us have got a uniform opinion about such unfortunate children with severe acute malnutrition and children out of school working in brick lanes with a lot of illnesses and morbidities should not happen. Can we be instrumental in changing for better life and health of the people? And that's our common concern. Where do these people with illness go for healthcare? They don't go anywhere. And that is what is found in NSSO estimates. Unless debilitating, most tend to self-treat, ignore, or delay availing of treatment, or resort to go to a cheaper rural medical practitioner or costs. 20% don't go anywhere because they are poor, and India holds a huge poverty burden of 20%, 22% of the world population living in India. And they live with the double burden of both communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases with poor income and poor nutrition. Where are getting treated? Where are the beds to get treated for the poor? The only consolation is the 38% of the total beds available are free beds in the public sector. Balance of 62%, about 11.9 lakhs out of 19 lakhs beds are in the private sector, and private sector is a mixed one. And the top of this mix of private sector is the top 5% posh hospitals like Apollo, Max, Fortis, Medanta, Manipal Care, and you all know it's all star hospitals where the rich go and they can afford it, let it run its own business. And that is Ministry of Finance approved. Without any regulation, they function in the health sector. But the 95% of private sector are in the small and medium. And there also, there are two categories, private for-profit and not-for-profit voluntary hospitals. Dr. Rama Baru will be speaking more on the contribution of non-for-profit voluntary hospitals. But the private sector, the rest of it, and that non-for-profit may be 25, I don't have the exact breakup, maybe 25% or maximum 30% of that. But 70 to 75% are for profit. So tragedies of infant deaths have shocked the media a few 2 years ago in Gorakhpur, Farrukhabad, Jharkhand, and Raipur, but it does. And last 1 year, coronavirus has taught us that the vulnerability of and fragility of our public health system. TV channels came mercilessly on debating lack of oxygen, lack of energetic medical care, doctors to be blamed. And then finally, the accountability is fixed on the political party that rules. But nobody is addressing the health system failure. It has been for decades, there is a cumulative neglect of funding, staffing, lack of infrastructure, lack of technology upgradation, and whatnot. But if you want a revamping, like Chhattisgarh did in 2000 when the first time the state was formed, it had a preferential option for the poor, and they were talking only about the pro-poor health policy, and that is part of the reform agenda, which is formulated by all of them. Luckily, in 2005, National Rural Health Mission came with a vision of a decentralization to district level and district management of health with a participatory bottom-up planning, emphasizing on quality and aiming supreme client satisfaction with intersectoral convergence. And they had the defined time-bound goals, and they were reporting publicly on their progress, all with an aim to provide primary health care, which is equitable, affordable, and accountable, and primary health care for the poor people and marginals. NRHM brought a paradigm shift from the way we approach to a distrust to trust, rigidity to flexibility in planning, centralized to decentralized planning, and with enough funds, functionaries, and with clear-cut roles and responsibilities, building capacities at all levels. This is one thing which is needed. Now, if such a decentralization has taken place to district level, what we need is a very efficient district health system and state health system, for which central government could provide technical assistance, and with a two-pronged strategy. One is improving managerial efficiency and absolute transparency in transactions. We could even employ national level management experts to help the states constitute a national cadre of public health service like Indian Medical Service, like an IAS. Why not? And there are good models of Tamil Nadu having a state public health cadre, so that we can avoid a EMT specialist managing malaria control or dermatologist managing TB control. Now, another system revamping is connecting the system with the community, and that is where the forebearers of ASHAs all over the world, and from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, Tripura to Ran of Kachiti, they are there. I met these ASHAs. This is a picture of ASHAs in Arunachal Pradesh, Upper Subansiri district on the China border, and they proved their worth in the COVID pandemic time, providing health services like in Chhattisgarh, the Mitanians delivered the essential medicines and things like that. Also in the surveillance and the human service, the ASHAs in Kerala and all have made, and Orissa, it's a good example. If they're useful, why not absorb them into the system and pay their regular salary and not honorarium? There is, with a strong project management team in every state, they have recruited a lot of contractual consultants, technical experts, and about 275,000 para health workers, not in the system, but they're running on a contractual basis. They were essential to run the project activities. It added value to the program implementation. And that is the cornerstone for transforming health services as a departmental activity to a mission mode. That quality of improvement led to client satisfaction and utilization of public health system in many states, including Bihar, which was condemned that nobody will walk into a government public health system. It changed. If they are inevitable to run the program, make them employees and consume the funds required, and that is a good fund absorption capacity. Now, the new baby in the block is the Health and Wellness Center. Luckily, to my utter surprise, they were doing very well. And I saw this in Bishnupur district in Manipur and Chitwara district because I have visited many health and wellness centers there. And what it is like, yeah, Amara hospital, that people have feeling this is our hospital because a lot of community interaction. They have a new bahu in the family. There is a new mini doctor Amara hospital made. So a retrained nurse or pharmacist or sector supervisor acting as community health officers. Important thing is many of them are living there also. So they are 24/7 mini hospital. There is a consultation. They can walk into, get some blood test done, urine test done, and they get medicine all they want for the high BP and other illnesses, cardiac ailments, everything. They don't have to go to PHC or CHC, and they get provide first aid or the fourth point in revamping. What is needed is we need annual planning to change because a lot of fund unutilized either gets lapsed or not get carried over to the next year. So the whole process of reworking the annual plan in December to January, and then the draft plan is submitted in January, and then it gets approval in February in the midst of your year-end closure and fast pace of implementation, and then otherwise fund get lapsed, and then the tranche of funds for that particular year reach by June after restarting the process in April. So there is finally what happened. You don't get time for an implementation window, not longer than 6 to 8 months from September to February. So instead of that, we can have a once a 5-year broad planning, work plan with the strategies and have year-wise goals and objectives and annual financial allocation approved in principle for 5 years, so that with a specific task, this gives flexibility in continuing long-term activities like constructions and setting up of nursing schools and things like that. And the block of only if you submit the utilization certificate timely, you will get the next thing. Will not happen. And funds may be earmarked for the beginning of the accounting year. When you get it, you fix the fund for salaries, electricity, water supply, and regular thing, including consumables like essential consumables like the oxygen. The fund should be earmarked from the beginning as soon as you get. You don't say that we haven't got the central government funds and you can wait. No, that should change. The next thing in the revamping is application of IT technology and e-governance. And NHM has got into it. And if it is a web-based advertisement for vacant and new post recruitment, including test and selection, all results are up in the web and it is not in closed files, and so that somebody can influence and rewrite the posting order for award of contracts or even payment of bills and invoices. Everything can be tracked and it eliminates the strikes at the root of corruption. Now, if such a thing, there are a list of litany of many more, and my fellow panelists will speak about that. But what it can do is, like, it changes the mission mode activity. People who are concerned, and like the tender loving care you give to this premature baby in your palm, if you care for the community will utilize it. That is what has happened is 28% of utilization of Kerala public health system to 48% in 2020. Appointment of 3 staff nurses for the round-the-clock care of maternity care deliveries to attend deliveries in Salem district phenomenally improved, and attracted all the deliveries that were taking place in private to the government in Tamil Nadu. You walk into Madras Medical College, you can see this difference. 7,000 and more than 7,000 patients walking in for OPD, outpatient consultation, out of which 2,000 gets admitted or discharged. The next one is the important thing that is needed is categorization of our PHCs to most difficult, less difficult, and ordinary, attractive, most comfortable PHCs. You do a categorization. You post the young medical officers soon after MBBS and their bachelors, they put them in the zone 1 of the most peripheral. After finishing 5 years or 7 years, whatever you decide, with extra increment and also your priority admissions in PGs with bonus mark, or they go for PG, they come back and they can come into zone 2 of subdivisional hospitals and towns, and then finally in the district hospitals. So these are computer locked systems of merit where they say it can, if tamper-proof promotion avenue, then it will make a difference. One principle in the postings is that no specialist should rot in the periphery. We did that in Chhattisgarh, and we, with the Joint Secretary, Mr. Vikas Shil, we pulled out 37 specialists rotting in PHCs to the CHCs and district hospitals so that specialist vacancies filled. And no more some minister influence MBBS fellow getting a leave vacancy appointment in district hospital. I end my this presentation with this picture of it. I'll come back again because 13 minutes, my time is over. This girl is an ANM who walks up 2 hours, climbs down 2 hours into almost like a pit, like Padalkot Hamlet in Tamia block of Madhya Pradesh, and climbs up all the register things, 3 hours climbing up, just to reach and provide services in that village. I salute her, and that leads to some discussions I can do on what should be, who should be entering our medical schools and nursing school, and whether it should be a district cadre posting nursing. I'll come to that issues after my fellow panelists finish the discussion. If we do seriously all these recommendations, what my fellow speakers talk about, then we are heralding a new era in public health, which will prove useful, like National Health Service in UK, and that will be drumming up and the celebration of a new event. Thank you. These are the women who use the drummers, which is a men's portfolio of the women empowerment they have been drumming up as I'm showing to the rest of the trainees in Kerala Institute of Local Administration. Thank you. Dr. Sundar Raman, who is my next speaker in this panel, to carry on with the rest of the presentations. Thank you. Let me stop sharing. Dr. Sundar, you are muted. Dr. Sundar, you are muted.
Yeah, can I have the share screen?
Oh, I'm not the host, Smriti.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I have, I think I have.
You got, okay.
Thank you. I'm going to focus a bit on a very specific area, and that is on human resources for health. I am a particular reason for choosing this particular area to focus on. There is a lot of lack of belief, lack of confidence in being able to run a robust public health system. The ordinary government officer, the usual government officer, has got into a thing where it seems a simpler opportunity to outsource it with his ends, the job ends with one contract, rather than all the nitty-gritties of running a public provisioning across the country. And one of the key reasons why people resist the notion of a universal public provisioning of healthcare systems is the inability to manage the problems of the public workforce, the human resources for health as it is. Now, I'm therefore going to say a few words and focus only on this issue And I'm sorry if it didn't meet the exact requirement, but I thought this is important to look at. Part of the reason is that almost from the 10th five-year plan, I've been watching this ever since privatization became the order of the day, that most of the policy questions that are raised about public health workforce raises that as if they are inherent problems, as if they don't admit of a solution. So even recently, as far back as little recently as 2 weeks back, I was talking with a state senior IAS officer on the plan for their right to health in their state. And the immediate response was, what with your workforce and their accountability, are you willing to take the risk and make yourself justiciable to healthcare? So this is seen as a big bottleneck. But the point which I'm trying to make in this whole presentation is only one point, that actually all these problems are amenable to solutions, and these solutions are not market-based solutions, but they do need creative and innovative ways to come across these common problems. I'm just giving a sense of where they are. Now, largely, these problems can be looked at the adequacy in numbers, the adequacy of, that is in the open market also, then attracting and retaining staff in public services, especially in rural and remote areas, and the problem of improved workforce performance, skills, motivation, and a number of other multiple challenges. Now, one point which we need to make about the workforce is that the health workforce is the fifth largest, highest sector of the workforce and can become even larger. As the world becomes increasingly heavy technology driven, automated, it displaces labor in a major way. And the number of people needed for the proportion of the population that need to be invested in agriculture, or for that matter, industry, manufacturing, all the rest becomes very small. So in fact, instead of thinking of a universal basic income, one can do much better if we think of a universal employment where the caregiving part of the economy is the major employer. So at some point, what I'm trying to say is that though we talk of doctors as the central point of the discussion and then nurses, there is in this whole area a wide number of people who are given employment to. And in fact, the team has to work together from the non-health support staff to the medical practitioners to be able to deliver healthcare with the required quality that we need on that. Now, in terms of adequacy, we now have a norm of 44.5 skilled health workers per 10,000. So you're not talking of the complete non-health support workers, not even of the auxiliary workers, but 44.5 doctors, nurses, and midwives. This is based upon certain scientific principles which they have done. It's not the last word on it, but it is definitely gives you a guiding principle. If we go by that, you would need 80 per 10,000 population or 8 per 1,000. And for a population of 1.3 billion, about 13 lakh doctors, 39 lakh nurses and midwives. And taking associate health professionals, a much larger amount of 20 lakhs, and support staff, this is not the technically qualified 20 lakhs. So this is the potential that you can actually provide. There's a huge resistance to providing this in public sector, both because of economic reasons and because of management reasons and governance reasons. But essentially, this is the potential that it has to actually provide employment, but also available. Now, one of the funny conundrums of our system is, after so much, we really don't know exactly the number of doctors and staff we have. I'm not going into this whole didactic discussion, but I'm saying that I've used alternatively the professional councils, an extrapolation from the professional councils data, which is not updated in a regular sense and therefore not a live register and reliable. There are very interesting ways it has been updated. And you have another from the NFSO, And you can see that the range goes from 6.4 per 10,000 to 20.8 per 10,000. That's a very wide range itself. Yet, for a number of reasons, one can work around these figures and still get a sense of where we need. The big point that I'm going to make on this is that really what you have is a very high skew across the states and within the state. You can see doctors and nurses, how actually you have, and the states on your left-hand side are the states with a large population, whereas your states on the right-hand side are your states with a much lower population. You have similarly for postgraduate seats also, we have even in terms, now it is precisely in those states where the gaps are high, where the requirement is high, that the medical college seats that are required are low. And therefore, this particular thing is to actually show the mismatch between where your investment in medical education is going and where the requirement for medical education is going. Now, this is a detailed thing that we presented to the Economic Advisory Commission just about 2-3 years back in 2019, where we were looking state by state on issue. And here is the big news that I am actually making on this. There is a current availability, number of seats, generation, closing it. You will see that actually in Group A, the Group 1, and in Group 2, and in Group 4, you really don't require any additional seats. In some of them, you require additional doctors, but given the current rate of generation, you're going to close the gap by 2024 or thereabouts. But in the others, you have already, in terms of Group 1, you have already reached many of the targets that are required on that. Whereas in West Bengal, you still have a major gap. And of course, Group 5, there's a huge number of requirement. And the last one is the total number of additional, last column is the total number of additional seats that will be required in colleges. And you can see that there is a huge number that is required on that. So a simple point that we are saying is, if you look at an aggregate number across India, you really do not have that much of a shortage despite various projections. The shortages are in some states, and unfortunately, there is no way of systematically transferring from the excess states to the lower states. There was a time when the nurses from Kerala would go and get employed all over the north. For a number of political reasons, that doesn't happen. And in fact, perhaps to the advantage of the people in Kerala, they will now go abroad rather than to interior India, but not necessarily to the advantage of the rest of India. But therefore, in terms of actually how do you shift the capacity to create, which has been created in some states, and the requirements which are in other states, becomes one of the key issues that we are. It also means that in many of these states, you can cap the number of medical and nursing seats and focus on quality and redistribution within it. Plus something that I'm saying, we have studied in some detail in Maharashtra with some of my students at one time, is the recruitment efficiency, the ability to convert people available for jobs in the market into filled positions in the government. And that has a certain set of problems associated with it, which is one reason why it's very low. If there are places, once in Jharkhand and UP, we actually did it through a hired HR agency, and they actually filled up a substantial part of the vacancies at one go. There were still vacancies. It's not so easy in Jharkhand and UP to ever fill it up. But the point about it is that these gaps are also related to recruitment efficiency. Whereas in the rest, the East, that includes West Bengal, Assam, it includes your Odisha, and the Northeast and in Central, there are increase in seats required, which may have happened because this is now 2 years. 2 years in the past is not so bad, far back, but it's there. Now, I do another calculation and look at the total human resource requirements of a 2 billion district normatively based upon the IPHS. I arrive at a certain sum of HR, and now I'm looking at different types of categories of personnel right across and say, what will it take to have a fully staffed district And you can come to something like what you're saying is 1.37 lakh crore for the entire country, if your public health system is fully staffed, would go on salaries of a particular sort. You can go up on this a bit, but you are still less than, you're somewhere little about 1% of the GDP. And you can actually, if you say 1.5% of the GDP, you're really safe in being able to provide the deployment which is required. But we are not providing anywhere near that. I mean, that's a different issue. But the point one is saying is that this degree of employment which is possible to generate, which is an advantage to generate, it is an equitable employment. It is going to put salaries into the hands of the poorest sections in the country. You are going to be able to actually generate this, and the amount of this. Now, this is something that we presented, at least wasn't challenged externally to the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister. So it's not something that is something that we've just made up within ourselves. And we've not been in the public domain, but what the hell? I mean, I don't think nobody is particularly interested in it one way or the other. So it's important to actually get this figures up. But then the issue is not only of numbers. The issue is also this key principle that is pretty well articulated in the National Health Policy, that on human resources, that workforce performance of the system would be best when we have the most appropriate person in terms of both skills and motivation for the right job in the right place, working within the right professional and incentive environment. That's a lot of ifs over there. But at some point, this is really the challenge of managing a public health workforce is a question of beyond the numbers getting in over here. Now, this has been actually studied. I was part of this expert committee long back, and it was interesting to see world over, even in the so-called most developed countries, we take Sweden, you take US, you take the Canadians, they have very similar problems with difference to workforce, public workforce in the US, and there are very interesting set of solutions. The point I'm really making is that this is not some inevitable problem, but a manageable problem. It requires
Sundar, can you one more minute?
Yeah, okay. There is a set of educational interventions, regulatory interventions, direct and indirect financial incentives, and management, environment, and social support that goes into managing this. Okay. I'll skip through this said, but remember in this different types of health workers, we are talking of newly created, the ASHA, the ANM, the nurse practitioner, the mid-level healthcare provider, the Ayush person retrained, the family medicine doctor. So you're talking of generating new professional boundaries. And you're also talking of looking at number of big steps and incremental steps. In regulatory interventions, compulsion does not work for a number of reasons or works in a very limited way, whereas there are other mechanisms that have shown better promise. You have monetary compensations to work, but roughly they only within a package. By themselves, they have very little to do. Management support and making a positive practice environment is perhaps one of the most effective things after redefining professional boundaries. So in some sense, there is a whole policy of what works where, and usually it is a bundle of interventions where is a matter of selection, training, professional boundaries, payment, and working environment that needs to be packaged to get it right. What does not work before that is a crisis in competence is a big issue. Nursing is a thing. And there is a crisis in ethics and motivation, and this highly crowded, competitive environment where people have paid 2 crores for their medical seat or post-graduation and then are crowded into the urban milieu and would not go where the needs are and are for competing for a very small segment of the population that can pay is one of the big drivers of the problem. And again, there are a number of ways which are known to work, includes not only what you do with the public sector, but includes what you do with the private sector in parallel. So if you're going to improve what happens in the public sector, you also need to attend to what happens in the private sector in one major way. What does not work, and we need to emphasize this, is public-private partnerships spectacularly don't work because you change the ownership, but that's not the problem. The problem is of how you are getting people there. And if a government can't do it, some non-governmental organizations, small, dedicated, not-for-profits are different. But as a system of outsourcing and PPP never works, pay for performance doesn't work, contractual terms of employment so that you have a bigger handle and we make this does not work at all. And these are things that we know by cross-country comparisons also. And my last slide, and I told you there are some big issues and there are some small issues. There is a crisis in specialists. There are issues about how we deal with the community health worker. It's a 1 million category workforce. The ASHA is a 1 million category workforce. Huge returns to make it into a framework where they are regular terms of employment, but they are also accountable in service and making primary healthcare professionally attractive. So there is a whole number of challenges. But these are actually doable things, and the ways which are pushed for solution of these problems are really non-workable things. So thank you. I stop with this. So this basically was my basic issue, that there is a set of issues, but they can be handled.
Thank you, Sundar, for such a thorough exposition on the HR issues and that what it amounts to in financial terms and part of the GDP. It's 1% of GDP HR alone. So we have to see, and that gives enough scope to demand 3% of GDP. Okay, next speaker is Dr. Yogesh Jain. Yogesh, please start.
So it's always a challenge to speak after Sundaraman and obviously Dr. Antony,
Yeah.
who are senior and people who have been in the health systems for much longer than I have been. But I would speak as a public health practitioner from rural Chhattisgarh on when we talk about a little bit about all the various components of health systems, the space stuff, skills stuff, and systems. So, and I would start by saying why go for these is also important to be considered. I hear in the media that one is talking about only preparing for the third wave, or are we preparing for future pandemics? If the need for this robust health systems, or actually to have resilient health systems for all health problems in future, by taking cognizance of the fact that we failed this time, people. I would say the third is the more important reason to do so. And I now want to draw upon this one slide from what I learned from the Thai model of universal healthcare, where they say, what is a triangle that can move the world in this case? If you want to get for universal healthcare, then one, that it requires the people's demand, which I think at the moment it has to be channelized and be expressed that there is a need for healthcare, because that's one of the classic problems about health is a human right, that healthcare is a human right, that people, when they are sick, they can't ask for it, and when they are not sick, they don't feel the need for it, and that's something that we need to all continue to do. And how that healthcare, how that health systems have to be developed to be able to deliver a UHC is, we have the knowledge and evidence, some of which we are sharing today together, all of us, and there has to be a political commitment and a will, which I think is missing in at the moment, but this is something that has to, we have to sort of struggle for. And if I talk about staff specific issues, I would say, yes, one, it's already been mentioned that we need a public health cadre. This is a necessary requirement for us to get the right type of robust health systems. And I would rather, the focus that that we've been hearing the previous two speakers speak more about physician and nurses. I would rather look at more focus on non-physician health workers being brought back, even though because it has not been given importance, even though it was already been recommended 10 years ago by the MCI also, the then MCI, whether it was to run the basic, the rural health, rural health practitioner course, or now the CHO course, which is being taken on, but is being implemented in a very timid way, is something that one has to sort of invest in more, not only through better training but also mentoring them. And the ASHAs, certainly, already been mentioned about 1 million such, are workers who are who need to be sort of supported more. I would say, so surely we need to train more formal health workers like doctors and nurses, but with all the concerns that Dr. Sundar just mentioned. But I would add to this very important component, which as a need, because of the conflict of interest, and because private practice by public system physicians is like public practice being within a single individual. A banning of private practice by system physicians, this is a bullet that we need to bite. Otherwise, we are unlikely to get systems that will really work with the staffing issue that we already have. Even if some people want to leave, I think they should be given a kick on their golden kick on their backsides, and then yet we start with something and continue with people who are committed to public systems and run the systems well. Communitization is necessary for in staffing. ASHAs and other non-physician health workers have to be supported. I would even add to this that for chronic illnesses, transferring power and responsibility in a sense to the support to the peer groups that can be formed for chronic illnesses would be one such area where healthcare can be actually taken out of hospitals and doctors' control. Teleconsultations with all the requirements, all the constraints that it removes the public physical examination from our repertoire of diagnosing illnesses, as well as unburdening the system of actually going to the people. Teleconsultations have a role, but a limited one, I would say. And using information technology that is supportive and not to police the peripheral health workers is something that we need to do, to use to support using apps that may be developed very well for the peripheral workers. And obviously the ASHAs need to be, I would clearly recommend this, that they need to be taken as, as workers and given them full wages from an increased pool of funding that goes into human resources. And that would be one way to improve the absorptive capacity as it is being criticized in healthcare, which is poor. Yes, there are these some establishments like Rogi Kalyan Samitis and hospital management committees need expansion, but and more more clear representation of the people. But these watchdogs and whatever community-based monitoring model that we have need to be sort of supported. Without which, and we can learn from this from the Brazilian experience in this. Far more, as well as experience from Maharashtra that we have had to improve the ownership and monitoring. Skills, I would say clearly in the staffing that we have, one skill that is completely missing, one set of practice that is missing in our system is something that we need to get is mentoring. Even physicians are not mentored in this country, forget about other non-physician health workers. So a formal program of mentoring, not only as individuals, but even as teams of people, whether it's at primary healthcare level or whether it's primary or at a secondary level care, has to be gotten into this as a separate new program. Training certainly of not only physicians, quality issues that have been already flagged, and I would say something that was recommended earlier, over to form district knowledge centers with the district hospital as a base to support the entire state. The district would be an important way to go for ensuring skill transfer. When it comes to stuff, I would say clearly these two things, both the drugs and the diagnostics, have to be made available if we want to reach anywhere close to any strength of the public health systems to improve the footfall. And so the fact that this should not be called free drugs, there should be drugs available, all the essential drugs and all the investigation that are essential diagnostics should be available from the public system, and not sort of people shunted to the private sector, without which I think any approach of a robust health system is impossible. So whether we know the Tamil Nadu Medical Services Corporation leads by example. I know that the other states have not warmed up to their example, but it's something that without which we cannot hope to get without free drugs and without drugs and diagnostics for all the requirements in primary healthcare. We cannot even think about anything that any of the staff or space can deliver. And the essential diagnostic list that has been made should be implemented and provided for by the public system, as some states are already trying to do. Space, I would say, should we have more medical colleges? I would clearly say, with all the cautions that Dr. Sundar mentioned, yes, it's not a great idea, because let's face it, physicians it seems, are not going to go to rural India or marginalized India, by just flushing people down into those areas is something that is unlikely to work. We should have those practices in place before we open more medical schools, as this otherwise this becomes an optical illusion. More nursing colleges, yes, I think that is certainly useful. To more allied health professional support. Their institutions are in doldrums, and they need to be supported far more. What about this oxygen plants? Yes, that is something that that has been talked about, but only in the light of COVID-like illness. But yes, there are more things. Beds, yes, 2 per 1,000 population is a requirement, and that should be gotten. ICU beds, 10% is being suggested for district hospitals. And what about pediatric beds? I hear a lot of people say about that the third wave, this bogey of pediatric problems occurring in the third wave of the COVID pandemic is actually a bogey. But yes, if that gets some services for the children for other illnesses, not COVID. COVID is not going to be a bad illness in children in the near future, in the third or fourth waves that I can think about. And but yes, it would be useful to get some beds for sick children also. Getting the regional virology research and additional vaccine production units in every state would be a great way to move forward. Medical oxygen factories in every state with the required tankers for immediate supply to hospitals, and a center for communicable disease control would be necessary. And LMO generation plants of 150 tons in every district hospital is also a clear way to go forward when it comes to space. And a 50-bedded isolation ward, which 10 should be for ICU beds, and minimum 5 ventilator beds. Though ventilators are often not used, are more useful for snake bites and other illnesses rather than COVID. So what about cities? We know that cities have failed the people in COVID. So to develop multi-use community centers, which can be used during natural disasters as well as pandemics and during lockdown periods, would be a way to go forward, even regarding future health systems, which can be used for isolation, quarantine, or community meetings also. So there would be also provision of water, sanitation, clean night shelter in all these places. Should be something that can be thought of while we go forward. In systems, I would flag 3 things. Surveillance, yes, surveillance of both the diseases and as of the determinants also would be a great way would be an important thing, something which is sorely lacking in our system at the moment. Medical audits of all our practices, including prescriptions, would be a formal program to put in place, and that is even monitored well, that it is done. And having health technology assessment units as in each health system, whether at a state level, being supported by a central health technology assessment unit would be one way forward, as I would say, which is something that that has been sorely lacking till now. And something like a health, a UHC, sort of a regulatory body, which is separate from the line departments of health, would be a great way to think about. And we need to think about universal health care sort of a paradigm, and not an insurance-based model that we have been subjected to, and somewhat we feel that we are resigned to that sort of a paradigm. Is something that we need to think out of the box at the moment and really start again thinking about UHC. This, and elasticity of the public health systems is necessary for managing pandemics and other crises that we can think about. So where immobile resources should be built and strengthened, but there should be all the mobile resources like skilled medical teams, technicians, and infusion pumps can be rostered and alerted for immediate deployment, and moved from one place to the other during programs. And that, obviously telemedicine, we have talked about production units for drugs, antivirals, and essential medicines, and, enforcing Clinical Establishment Act, which is, human and not only, sort of very generic which is does not recognize the diversity of health services that are provided. And finally, I would say that it can't be said enough that we need to regulate the private sector for quality, rationality, and pricing, which is something that is completely uncontrolled at the moment. Thanks for allowing me to be in this.
Thank you, Yogesh, for that crispy presentations. And my God, from Sundar's HR to your plethora of suggestions, quite a lot food for thought. I invite Rama Baru now to start her presentation.
Thank you very much. I do not have a slide presentation because the slide presentation blocks my thought process. Apologies for that.
No problem.
I'm basically going to build on my earlier speakers, and all of them alluded to the role of the private sector in different ways, in terms of at the state level, in terms of human resources, and lastly, Yogesh talking about the need to regulate the private sector. What I want to say is that if we want to talk about revamping the public health system, I think the elephant in the room, in a sense, is the extent and the nature of the private sector and the way in which it has really put its tentacles into the public health system. So one of the important ways we have to look at it is that there are many ideas of commercial enterprise that has already come into the public system in very many ways, whether it is provisioning, whether it is drugs and technology, or it is medical and nursing education, including the allied professions that Yogesh spoke about, and also Sundar did. So what and I think it's very important.
Dr. Rama, you can switch off your video since audio will be clear.
Yeah. Can you hear me clearly? Because I've now
very clearly, very clear.
There's a failure of electricity, so
it's
I
very clear, Rama.
Okay.
Please continue.
So what I'm saying is that if you have to conceptualize the revamping of the public health system, we have to engage with the very, very diverse and the extensive presence of the private sector in these various subsystems of the health service system. And in saying that, I just want to make the point that the public health system itself, and it's very important to look at the kind of beating the public health system has taken, both in terms of its morale and its performance, because of rampant commercialization outside it and within it. In fact, Yogesh spoke about how we must ban private practice by government doctors. It's been a huge challenge. It's not as if states haven't tried it over time, but that has been resisted. But the other very important aspect of commercialization, in my view, is the contractualization of health workers. So, ASHAs are not just the frontline workers. There are many states where, in fact, doctors are hired on a contract basis. So the question that really arises is, so you start looking, you do not have that kind of engagement and commitment if you're on a contract basis. You're constantly thinking of which is the next better job I can get. So when we look at medical education, when we look at nursing or the allied professions, in fact, we've just done a paper, Archana Divate and I have done a paper for the India Higher Education Report. And when we looked at the data that we could put together for all these various aspects of education for health systems, we find that it is highly privatized. It was quite shocking to see the proportion of private to public, while the average in India may be 50-50 or 60-40. There are some states where it is really skewed, especially the southern and the western states. So when when you have a highly commercialized medical and nursing education, what kind of public ownership of the health system can you really inculcate at the level of values, at the level of commitment, and even to imbibe a normative function of the public health system? So these are some of the issues that are constantly coming up. And when you look at diagnostics and drugs, today, much of it is in the private sector. So what I'm basically saying is, when we are looking at the revamping of the public sector, we have to look at it in terms of the power dynamics also that exists. You do find that the corporate and the middle private sector is able to influence policy at both the central and the state levels. And this has been happening for quite some time. So you have the public health concerns being discussed while the private sector continues to influence the direction of public policy. I just want to raise the issue of, COVID-19 provided us an opportunity to really revamp and strengthen public health systems. But if you look at the Niti Aayog reports for the last 5 years, you find that there has been a very systematic roadmap for greater privatization. When they talk about increasing medical colleges, they're talking about increasing private medical colleges, which will then partner with district hospitals and then provide greater capacity for medical education. Similarly with nursing education and other allied professionals. So you find that the roadmap provided by Niti Aayog is really asking for greater foreign direct investment in health. You're talking about greater import of technologies for health. And you are also talking about the importance of building public-private partnerships. Both Sundaraman and Yogesh Jain and you, Dr. Anthony, had talked about how public-private partnerships is not the way forward. But the reality is, in the power dynamics that is being played out, more insurance, public insurance for the poor, greater spaces for private insurance to come in, the importance of strengthening, and in fact, corporate hospitals today have diversified. They are no longer a phenomena of metro cities, but they have reinvented themselves and they have created hubs and spokes models for really getting into smaller, lower tier towns and making their presence felt. So in all of this, the COVID-19 crisis actually shows us how in the moment of crisis, the private sector has largely gone unaccountable. And there has been no effort by the government to actually rein in the private sector, even in the case of a national emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been examples from other parts of the world where there have been short-term nationalization, like in Spain, of the private sector. So what I'm basically saying is that the private sector in India has come to a space where it is able to be in sync with the political class and the way it thinks. Of course, they need a public health system where the market cannot be responsible or responsive. In fact, it was very telling that when at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, the statement from both the hospital groups in CII and FICCI was saying that we cannot afford to, convert our beds to COVID beds because we will lose our profit margins. Now, if this is the attitude of the private sector, even in the time of a national crisis, you start wondering what is the reining in that we can actually do, especially when they have been unreined. And the whole regulation story is one of power dynamics. So how do you bring that in? Of course, the Clinical Establishments Act was very important. It was fought for by many, many groups and progressive movements. But having said that, the resistances from the private sector were very, very strong. And we know the case has been extremely varied in different states. Similarly, the question of how do you regulate the corporate sector? who is going to regulate the corporate sector? Is it the case that the corporate sector is very closely now allied and has influenced the ideology of the present government for greater privatization? So if all the central government apparatus is showing you for greater privatization on one side, and also talking about building public systems which will respond to certain kinds of crises. So we are in a quandary of really a mixed system which is skewed towards a privatization agenda, and the contradictions that it is going to bring forward, and the frustrations which many of us are dealing with. And how do you then deal with this situation? The other very important aspect, which I think needs to be highlighted, is there is and has been a non-profit sector in this country. There have been networks of hospitals that have continued to do very good work, but they are also facing the onslaught of commercialization. Many of them, and especially talk about the Christian Medical Association and the Catholic Hospital Association, that run number of smaller hospitals, dispensaries, clinics, and who are serving populations where there is a weak public health system and there is pretty much not really a private system that is operating. And what has happened over time is that they have been forced to close down because they don't have the kind of funds or the competition with the private sector to survive. And I think there are larger hospitals in the non-profit sector that have actually transformed and commercialized themselves. And if you see many of them today, they resemble the corporate hospitals. So I think the power of market, the power of an unreined private sector has actually distorted our possibilities of strengthening public systems. Yes, we can continue to strengthen and fight for strengthening of public systems. But all I'm saying is the market seem to pose limits on that. And I think it's very important to recognize that as we fight for strengthening public systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rama, for that thought-provoking discussion. I would, my job is how to just sum up in 5 minutes. It all started with a brilliant way shown by Dr. Sundar of what works and what did not work, and the challenges posed. And so he has given a few suggestions what does not work, and that has to be, we have to be very cautious about, and the challenges we have to address. So that was very good, and the economics that he worked out of the need of expanding the human resource, which already get, and he has also brought out that it is not the shortages, but in the distribution that the fault lies. So how do we get the doctors to the periphery, or is there an alternative when the doctors don't go think about alternatives? Yogesh Jain has summed up the people's demand has to be there, and then he very emphatically said ban private practice in the public sector. And a few other things which is important is the whole aspect of mentoring and being the district hospital as the apex of the tertiary care in every district uniformly in the 733 districts. So not necessarily they have to bank upon the medical colleges in the area, which is a skewed distribution of medical colleges in southern part of India rather than the northern belt. It is not there. And also the health technology assessments and what universal healthcare is not to be achieved by an insurance model. I would, if at the end, I'll just put a screenshot of one slide on that. Rama Baru said how one important question is how to inculcate the value system in the public health system functionaries of serving people and to be more accountable. And the big challenge of how can we rein in private sector. And she really emphasized the need for co-opting or supplementing and enabling the not-for-profit private sector to continue their role in spite of all the threats and uncertainty about FCRA and the funding they get and support, and many small health projects that comes up. What Sundar, being the global public health movement champion and the president chairperson of that, I was expecting Sundar to throw maybe some comments, question answers. How is an American model of insurance system or a completely public health system supported by the country like UK? Is that a model, or other alternatives like successful models of Indonesia, where public health movements are there, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, Cuba, and all. So maybe a few lines from Sundar I expect in the discussions coming up. I just wanted to show one, I'll take only 2 minutes to show you one slide of, to show you, is that is the insurance the answer to support the poor? You know, under the Ayushman Bharat, PMJY, Prime Minister Jan Arogya Yojana had the potential to enroll 65%. The government thinks it has got the potential, but it is already enrolled. That is not true. That is the eligible population. We have got an assured ESI scheme for 15% of people, and a small one of central government health services and PSU coverage. It's not an insurance system, but it is that's maybe less than 5%. So about 26%, 39 crore are uninsured, and some of them are 6%, maybe the rich who can fully afford the costly treatment of the star hospital. But the balance 20% are the middle class who can get trapped due to high out-of-pocket expenditure in a crisis like an ICU admission and other in the illnesses like this in a pandemic. And what is this Ayushman PMJY insurance coverage? NFHS 5 shows in the vast stretch of Bihar, it is 14.5% only. Even in big state like Maharashtra, 20%. Karnataka, the South Indian model of better healthcare system, 28%. So even in those states which have the out-of-pocket expenditure during admissions, NSS estimation was 7 times higher. Now, the insurance agencies, they report as of May 14th, there are 22,955 crore from 14.82 lakh customers, and they settled only 62% of the claim amount of actual expenditure. Maybe they can say that some of them may be exaggerated claims, but 38% is also out-of-pocket expenditure. So panicky people now with this boogie, as Dr. Yogesh said about the third wave coming and all, the premium for 2 to 3 lakhs sum assured has gone up to 5 to 7 lakhs. This is only to show that insurance is the final answer for everything. It is a mistaken now. I just want to emphasize on that point as the final thing. And I hand over the next session to Smriti and Anil on the question answer session. So I end up my role right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Antony, for briefly summing up the entire discussion and presentations given by all the speakers. With this, we come to the end of the first session. Now it's time that we move on to the second session, which is the Q&A session, where we will put across the questions to our speakers. These questions we received during the discussion, during the presentations from our audiences. So first, I would request Dr. Antony. There are questions put to Dr. Antony from Digan, which first question is saying, regularization of ASHAs and part-time health workers will need huge funds. The direction of policy is more towards privatization. How can India reconcile this contradiction?
Answer is, what is the alternative? You continue exploiting them, their 24 hours work, you said is a part-time voluntary work, and you say that it is needed, and all the work, quite a lot of work was loaded there. If they are needed, you pay for it. You find money for your smartphones, for your children's distance education in the high school, your virtual meetings, everything. From even the poorest of the poor, street vendors are buying smartphones because there is no alternative without a thing. So the government has to find. With all the full-fledged appointments, Sundara has shown it only works out to 1% of the GDP. At present, we are allocating 1.3% of GDP. The expenditure of ASHA, expenditure for other contractual employee of 2,75,000, it will come up to a decent 3% or less than 3%, and we will have a better health system.
Right, right. Now, the other question I would request Dr. Sundara Raman to kindly answer. A large number of our trained doctors are working outside the country. Is brain drain a reason for shortage of doctors in the country?
It's a tricky question. My contention has been that when it comes to all categories except specialists, we don't really have a crisis. Because there is a distributional crisis than a crisis of absolute number. In specialists, we have a problem. In specialists, my sense is that the main form of brain drain is internal. Because now with medical tourism, high value tourism as the order of the day, there are many hospitals which in Chennai, in Hyderabad, in Bangalore, which are catering predominantly to medical tourism. So instead of the Indian doctor specialist going abroad and providing services there, the foreign patients are coming to India and you're providing services. All your specialists are getting positioned into that particular position. So you are having a huge movement away from the services of specialist healthcare, but with further deleterious conditions, because they are setting a different pace and logic within the system over here. And as Rama was pointing out, the power play that exists between their powers that are built up and the rest, the way they determine standard is a problem. However, in certain critical areas, like psychiatrists in particular, in ophthalmologists in some particular area, we are so tenderly placed that even the loss of a handful would compromise our services seriously. So there are, and these are the same areas where internationally they are being invited in a big way. So in some sense, what you are having is there are certain areas in which the external brain drain, especially in certain specialist areas where it's a huge problem. In nursing, there is a huge drain, but it's not necessarily a problem. At this point of time, not for us, not within the larger frame. In a much larger sense, it is a problem because we do have a nursing shortage. But at this point of time, it is people working, skilled worker, migrating, foreign remittances. There is a different logic that comes into play.
Dr. Yogesh Jain, there is one question for you. In fact, there are two questions. First, I'll ask you the first question. Caseload and fertility rates in some states in South India are much higher than those in the North. How can this be explained?
Not relevant to this present discussion. Obviously, it is due to better reporting, but not so much a function of poorer systems. I think it's clearly if you don't measure, then you don't then you don't diagnose, and if you don't measure, then you obviously will pick up fewer problems. So that clearly has been the case. I don't think case fatality rates are higher in southern states. Clearly, other numbers are clearly a measure of how much you diagnose.
Right, and there is one more question, which is again from one of the audiences, which says that Britain's COVID-19 tracking app NHS was a total disaster, even though it was developed with a large investment. App had a lot of bugs and glitches. With the reference to that, how successful is our own Arogya Setu app, which is made on a much smaller investment as compared to NHS?
I think it has
It
failed.
gives good. It gives good competition to the British, which has failed. It's difficult to decide. I mean, it's a washout, but I don't know whether it's more washed out than the British. That's true. Even in the larger universal digitization of public health system, we abandoned a particular system after a few lakh investment. They abandoned it after £6 billion were invested in their health architecture, and then they abandoned. So generally, our failures are cheaper than their failures.
Right. Right. Rama ma'am, there is one question for you, that do you think that COVID-19 fiasco will force a rethink of the focus on privatization?
Well, there's a lot of anger in the people with the lack of response on many issues, whether it was the vaccine or the lack of oxygen, etc. But it has, I don't know if it will translate into a rethink on privatization. If anything, it's business as usual, because even in the COVID package, there was no real increase to strengthen public health systems. And the Niti Aayog is going on only pushing for greater privatization. So it was a great moment in history to actually commit yourself to building a public health system and to invest in it and to really revamp it. But that doesn't seem to be the case in the way in which the government has responded to the crisis. It has also undermined federalism. And I want to say this because this tendency to greater centralization has also meant that the respect that state governments are needed at that time of COVID, whether it was in terms of greater investments, greater supply of various PPE and other kinds of kits, and also the oxygen crisis, it was completely mishandled by the center. And it is almost as if we will give to whom we want, and those who can't manage, you manage on your own, you go for global tendering to get your vaccines. Is this the attitude? I mean, this is certainly not an approach to respecting federalism. And I think that's really worrying, because ultimately health is a state subject.
There is one more question for you, Rama ma'am. The fees per year of government medical colleges in Maharashtra is between 1 rupee to 4 lakh rupees. I believe it's 1 lakh rupees to 4 lakh rupees. 100 times than that it was in 1970. Anand Phadke has asked this question. How do we expect a doctor, even from such colleges, to join the government service for a salary of 50 to 60,000 rupees? In private colleges, the annual fees from 10 lakh onwards.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Anand. That's the point I was trying to make. And in fact, what is very, very important for us to understand is that there are thousands of students who are actually going abroad to study medicine, not in the US. Of course, the really rich go there maybe, but they're going to China, they're going to Uzbekistan, they're going to Russia, and now more recently the Philippines. And and especially China and Wuhan, the largest number of students are from Kannur, Kerala, who are traveling to China to study medicine. They come back and they are not able to pass the FMG exam, that is the Foreign Medical Graduate exam. So you have a very large pool of unemployed doctors returning from these parts of the world. And, so the trends of privatization now don't know boundaries. They are cross-border in that sense. I completely agree with Anand, and this is worrying.
Right. Dr. Jain, there is one question from Rishika Maheshwari asking that is community involvement possible in socially and economically fragmented states? Caste system is a big problem in states of North India.
Oh, surely it's possible. and it is already happening, and it just needs to be sort of to be supported, as well as facilitating organizations that are in the civil society need to work on it, work on more. And at this moment, the culture is to sort of you know to sort of stigmatize and sort of trivialize the role of civil society organizations by causing problems in funding or supporting. Or at this moment, we don't see, even though some lip services provided by the Niti Aayog,
Right.
civil society organizations are rejected at the moment by the people in power at the moment. We haven't. There's no voice that people are able to bring onto the table at this moment, even though a couple of meetings have been called by by this think tank, but nothing has really happened in a sense. And so how would, there's a culture of not supporting civil communities in their decision making at the moment, or people who are working with them, which needs to be sort of brought back, I think, if we are really serious about it.
Right.
Smriti,
Dr. Sundara Raman?
can I,
Yes,
Smriti, just
yes,
one second.
yes.
Can I
Yes.
add on to what Yogesh said? See, the real community ownership, it has to come. Civil society organization also may be motivated some youngsters, and they try to enable and motivate the community leaders to come. It's by and large is an external agent. But if you want really from the community represented and get their voices, and they are part of the governance, you have to have something like Kerala's model of Panchayati Raj institution. 73rd Amendment is uniform across the country, but certain states like Kerala and now recently in Odisha, there is a movement based on local self-government leaders, Panchayat Ward, Gram Panchayat Ward members being represented. If by majority, if they are scheduled caste or tribe, they become, and they're compulsorily given a voice, and the Gram Panchayat institutions like sub-centers comes under the role. And Kerala, it has shown, and it is shown even into the extent of palliative care model, the community ownership. So if that can, these are, I mean, the path is shown, whether we accept it is the question. Thank you.
Right. Dr. Sundara Raman, there is one question from Anurag Bhargav. Do you have any comment? He's asking, do you have any comment on the new curriculum of NMC and the other initiatives like National Exit Exam with reference to the issues which you have discussed?
I haven't actually examined the new curriculum. I mean, among various things, this is not something that I have looked at. And the need in that sense of a standardization across the country of a single thing, one proportion of seats being open to it is all right. That one proportion everybody gives into the need pool is all right. But there's multiple systems of recruitment, provided they have a standard of being fair and transparent, must be allowed. To have a single or have led to many distortions. Tamil Nadu, there is a protest, the CMC Vellore is in court. There are many ways in which it is one thing to say 20% of your seats, 30% of your seats must go into a common pool. It is another to mandate it completely, which I think is really a poor thing. There is another question, if I may take, related to this medical college scene from Anand about this, that what do you think of nationalizing medical colleges or allowing them to charge fees only up to what government medical colleges do? I think there is a nationalizing will, given the current polity, call for a much more political will than is available. But something is happening in these private medical colleges. They are not viable. Many of them are just not viable. If you prevent them from corrupt practices, high overcharges, under the table charges, this is not very difficult to do because these are large charges. People are seriously affected. People are going to court and asking relief so that they are not made to pay 50 lakhs, etc., before their certificate is released to them. You know, things like that. It's not some small operation happening. So if you are able to enforce a certain fee structure and a thing, most of these will soon to be taken over. So you would actually find that you are able to take them over at much lesser cost and build them into a public system We are having that in some level in the engineering college. Government tends to find other private owners for them if they have to take over. Many of them have loans that they have not repaid. Many of them have, so you can use a whole lot of soft measures to be able to actually step back from the privatization of medical education that has taken place. If any government with the political will to do so has come, there are soft pathways to do that. So that's the point about it. The larger point is that the political will.
Right. Dr. Baru, there is one question which Sarmishta Sahu has put for you. Can't private and public sectors coexist? The current system seems to have failed in meeting the requirement. Can't a healthy private sector take some load off the public health system?
Well, the key word there is a healthy private sector. What do you do with a private sector that has been rent-seeking, that has wrested public subsidies for its own ends and has resisted regulation? I think when you say the private sector, I want to make a difference between non-profit and for-profit, because there are examples of non-profit institutions, even if they're small and distributed unevenly in the country. There are examples where they have tried to do what she calls as the healthy private sector, that they have collaborated with public health systems, they have concerns for the poor, they built, they've even worked with technology and have supported, for example, the essential drugs movement. There have been many movements in the history of this country where the alliances came from the non-profit sector. So from community level institutions right up to tertiary hospitals, they have been important leaders in this. And I would still say some institutions like CMC Vellore still shine with those kinds of values and ethos. So I think when you say a healthy private sector, we have to differentiate between the for-profit and non-profit. To make that distinction is important.
Right, right. Dr. Yogesh, there is one question for you, that with reforms which lead to better salaries, transparent recruitment, transfer, promotion policies, working and living conditions, massive reduction in bureaucratic directives, etc., why can't we have more doctors in public services in rural areas?
Yeah, I mean, I hope it happens, and we all these things, if they can be done, I think they would be able to make some change. But I would be able to shed my cynicism that doctors are not going to go to marginalized areas. Maybe they do, and but I think it's also related to the entire process of selection of and the class divide of the students who get into medical education, and that also determines where their final choices are. I think the changes that are required to sort of correct this imbalance that we are talking about requires very fundamental changes in our society, in our social structures also. If they can be done, why not? That would happen.
Right. Dr. Antony, I think we are about to reach our time limit. We might run short of time. There is one question I would need your quick reaction to it. From Prem Kashyap Mishra, he is asking, what are some measures which we can adopt from healthcare systems of various countries to improve India's health system? Do you think that the education and healthcare system somehow in India has become a business? Antony, sir, I
got muted. I just wanted to leave that question to Sundar to answer, and I would instead complete what Yogesh is, that explanation, whether we get doctors to the rural areas. And Dr. Anand Phadke put a remark that don't the rural areas also require a doctor as the team leader, not only the family welfare, health and wellness center nurse practitioner, but can they? It's right. We can get, don't the army get, AFMC Pune have doctors for the army? They get under the 5-year short service commission. The army pays the entire fee. Why, if the government is serious, if those PHCs and districts have medical students recruited from those areas and they are under a bond and the government pays their medical education fee and get back to the system on a commitment. Only those who want those seats should be reserved. Why? Because we in SHRC Chhattisgarh and NHSRC, that PHFI did a study. Why, in spite of all the difficulties in Bastar area, some doctors do excellent service. The answer we got is, it is their family upbringing. The reason why many of the family members, being a postmaster or a school teacher, worked in tribal area, they developed a cultural affinity. They imbibe their ethos and living style and difficulty, and they want to get back. If that study proves, the big question remains is, who should be entering our medical colleges and nursing school? People from those areas, medical aspirants from there should get the first priority. They will go back. They will serve their, now even without a government job, they might get back.
Right.
So that's the
Right.
explanation we have to try. I leave the other question to
That
Sundar.
question to Sundara Raman sir. Yes.
So thank you, Anthony, for passing it. You had great expectations from me from this person. My problem is that each country takes 10 minutes to cover. I think somewhat difficult to tell the story of the American system or the German system or the Japanese in this anything less than that, because the context is not very well known to us. There are many things that are very good in different systems. And it's not only the UK system, which is actually under a heavy pressure of privatization, but even the Germans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, there are many things that one can learn from. My own favorite is Thailand, like many people know, because it has done so at remarkably affordable rates, provided a huge degree of universal care. It's kept the idiom of the modern strategic purchasing, but in practice, 95% of providers is public in the primary care sector, and except for Bangkok, even in the public sector, and it has done very high service, even in the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of absolute numbers, it has done much better, much less stringent lockdowns and much less requirements for on economic collapse. And it's one of the most resilient systems in the world. So I think there is a lot we can learn from that. Sri Lanka, 95% of your secondary tertiary care is in the public sector. It has problems in the primary care sector, but overall it has a much better record in being able to do preventive care. It's something which is again something that we can look up to. Brazil had a reputation which is now gone with the COVID-19 mismanagement in a major way, but they did start off on a primary care system that had great strength upon that. So my sense is that it's one must look at it. So if you look at something like the Germans or the Japanese, you're looking at private providers, but purchased by the government, on different types of sickness funds. But then you must see it in its entire context. The Japanese, for example, have a legal ban against any profit making in the private sector. You can't, for example, have an FDI repatriating dividends back home. You can't have it. It's not allowed. The Germans don't allow their insurance companies to make, they have to be not for profit and have to be tested to be so. So when we look at some part of their system without understanding the entire context, many of these are publicly administered single payer systems which are effectively controlled. The actual systems of the thing have a history in which they have developed. Similarly, the Canadians, the Australians. So in each one of them. So there is a huge amount to learn from. And we must wonder why we have not learned and why we continue to imitate the worst forms of the US system, which no person in the US, including their respective presidents for the last 5 to 10 presidents, would recommend. So even the president of the USA does not recommend their system. And yet you are different models, including our present push for managed care options, all are drawn from the US, of saying out-of-pocket expenditure shall be risk-pooled This is all the US model. So in an inordinate way, the US model influences India, though in some sense, in the entire world, especially in the developed world, it is by their own admission the worst model going.
I believe our esteemed panel of speakers have answered all your questions. And now I will request Mr. Anil Nair, the editor of Policy Circle, to kindly speak a few words and announce the next week's webinar.
Yeah, and I must mention, Anurag Bhargava has mentioned that Cuba should be mentioned. Their annual Liberation Day, the Moncado thing, is coming on Monday. And in some sense, the Cuban Revolution and what it has done for healthcare is also an outstanding example of a good healthcare system. And there are lessons from Vietnam and Costa Rica also.
No, I
Right.
just want to come in, Sundar, and say that there are a lot of rumblings in Cuba also. After the stepping down of Castro.
Fidel Castro. Yes.
Right. Now I would request Mr. Anil Nair to kindly come and speak a few words.
Thank you, Smriti.
Can I express a vote of thanks to Policy Circle for organizing these 3 webinars, and many panelists were my good friends of mine, and they are extremely grateful for this discussion. And you got Niti Aayog to endorse this, and I would strongly recommend our desires and expectations conveyed to Niti Aayog, and they don't have to pay us. We are all brilliant people, have spent our lifetime on public health and giving you ideas which is free compared to PricewaterhouseCoopers or KPMG. It's absolutely free suggestion for the improvement of the country. So take it seriously to Niti Aayog. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Then over to you.
Thank you.
Finally, Mr. Nair, please. You
Thank
say
you,
a
Dr.
few
Antony.
words.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for helping us put together this wonderful series. And I also would like to thank Dr. Sundar Raman, Dr. Yogesh Jain, Dr. Emma Baru for accepting the invitation and sharing their views. I also extend my, I thank the audience for not being very patient and asking so many wonderful questions. Next week, now Delhi Dialogues will be back with an entirely different topic: India's global engagement, opportunities and challenges. So that has nothing to do with the public health system, but we will definitely put together a paper and push it to policymakers. We need your help in doing so. To the audience, we will see you next week at the same time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Smriti. Please wind up the discussion today, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nair, and thank you so much to the esteemed panel of guests for being with us this evening, sparing your precious time. Thank you so much, Dr. Antony, and hope to see you all again next week. Till then, goodbye and take care.
Thank you, Sundar.